Well, good morning, Jumpstarters, and I hope that you guys are ready for another Sunday of Jumpstart Worship. Now today, we're going to continue learning about some of the miracles that Jesus did while He was here. And today, we've got two really cool stories that are going to go hand in hand and show us something that two people had in common. Now the first story is about a man named Jairus and about his daughter, and she was very sick. The other story is about a woman in a crowd that has been sick for a very long time. But both of these stories had one thing in common. And we're going to learn what that was as we dive into those stories today. But first, you guys know the routine by this time. We're going to go ahead and worship together this morning. So go ahead and get ready as we dive into song together this morning.
Let revolution start, let it begin with me. You're the king of my heart and you have set me free. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love. From the moment time began, you had a purpose, you had a plan. You hold my future in your hands and I believe it's true. You reached out and you rescued me. You gave me love for the world to see. In what I do and the words I speak, yeah, I belong to you. It's simply amazing the way that you save me. I want the world to know. Let revolution start, let it begin with me. You're the king of my heart and you have set me free. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love. With every step I take, with every breath I breathe, I want the world to know how much you mean to me. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love. A revolution, a revolution. You put your love in my heart, I show the world who you are. A revolution. It's simply amazing the way that you save me. I want the world to know. Let revolution start, let it begin with me. You're the king of my heart and you have set me free. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love. With every step I take, with every breath I breathe, I want the world to know how much you mean to me. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love. Let revolution start, let it begin with me. You're the king of my heart and you have set me free. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love. With every step I take, with every breath I breathe, I want the world to know how much you mean to me. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love. I want to shout it out, I want the whole world to see your love.
Well, today as we continue talking about the miracles of Jesus, we're going to open our Bibles to Mark chapter 5. And in Mark chapter 5, we find these stories that start in verse 21. Now, over these next few verses, we're going to see two different miracles that Jesus performs, but there's going to be one unifying thing that brings these stories together, and it's faith. You'll see Jesus talk to each of these individuals about faith and how their faith is what motivates them in these moments. Now, for a lot of us, we may be thinking to ourselves, what exactly is faith? What does the word faith mean? Well, for me, it's easiest to understand when I think about faith as being believing or trusting in something. And I'm going to ask you to do something in just a few moments that's going to test your faith. It's going to test what you believe and trust in. But before we get into that, let's dive into the story. In verse 21, Jesus and his disciples are traveling, and they're met by a man named Jairus. Now, Jairus is a leader of a synagogue in the city, and Jairus comes to Jesus because his daughter is very sick. Jairus comes to Jesus and he says, I need your help. My daughter is very sick, but I know that you can heal her. So please come with me to my house and heal my daughter. Jesus agrees, and Jesus and the disciples, they set off towards the man's house. And while they're traveling on the way, the Bible tells us that a crowd begins to gather around and to follow Jesus. Much like we would experience maybe at a parade or at a Saints game or with a lot of people around us, there was a lot of commotion, and Jesus stops in the middle of the crowd and he looks at his disciples and he said, "Someone has touched me. Who is it?" Now the disciples, remember, they're in the middle of a crowd. They look at Jesus and they look at one another and they say, "Jesus, we're in the middle of a crowd. There's all of these people around us. Lord, there's no way that we could possibly identify who this person is that bumped into you." And Jesus said, "No, there was something different about this." And as he looks around, there's a lady who steps forward from the crowd. And she says, "Jesus," she says, it was me. It was I who reached out and touched your garment." And the Bible tells us that the lady explains herself in Mark chapter 5, and she says, "Lord," she says, "I have been sick for a very long time. I've been dealing with a physical condition for a long time. And I've seen every doctor I can think of. I've tried every remedy that I've read about. I've tried everything, and nothing has made me well." And Jesus looks at the woman, and this is interesting. In Mark chapter 5, verse 34, he says, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." There it is, that word faith. Jesus tells her, he says, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed." The Bible tells us that the woman, that she was healed in that moment. Now, while Jesus was interacting with this lady, remember, he's following Jairus to his house where his daughter is very sick. There were some people from Jairus' house who came and they met and they were talking to Jairus, and Jairus comes to Jesus and he says, "Jesus," he says, it's over. My daughter has died. Don't worry about coming to my house." But once again, Jesus says something to Jairus. In verse 36, he says, "Jairus," he says, "don't be afraid. Only believe. Only have faith." There we see it again, this connecting factor between these two stories, faith. The Bible tells us that Jairus and Jesus, they continue their journey and they come to Jairus' house, and there are people gathered around outside who are mourning and who are crying because this girl has passed away. But the Bible tells us that Jesus goes into the house and he goes into where the child is and he lays his hands on her and he speaks over her. And the Bible tells us at the end of Mark chapter 5 that the little girl is brought back to life, that she raises from the dead right there. And the Bible shows us these two miracles with this one thing in common, this idea from Jesus of faith. Now, I told you earlier I was going to ask you to do something to help you understand faith and to kind of test it. So I want all of you, wherever you're watching, I want you to stand up wherever you are. Now, you're probably either sitting on a chair or sitting on your couch or something like that. And I want you to, now that you're all standing, just go ahead and sit back down. Now, to help us understand faith and to think about it in a different way, when you sat back down, did any of you, before you sat down, lean down under your couch and check to make sure that the legs of your couch were still there? Or that the legs on your kitchen chair, that they weren't wobbling or they weren't messed up or anything like that? No. When we walk into a room and sit down on a chair, we just sit. We just believe that that chair is going to hold us. We have faith that a chair is going to function, it's going to do what it's supposed to do. What we see from this story from Mark chapter 5 is that both Jairus and the woman in the crowd, that their faith, their belief was that Jesus could heal them, that Jesus could do a miracle for them. And as I think about it today for us, I'm encouraged by this story. Because the chairs that you're sitting on, the chairs that we test every day, that we put our faith in, there may be a day where we sit on those and they break. There may be a time where your favorite chair, that it gets too small, or you have to get rid of it, or it gets lost, or something like that, and it may not be able to have your faith anymore, your trust that it'll hold you up. But the reality that we see from Mark chapter 5 is the reminder that our faith in Jesus, that He will always come through. That these two people, Jairus and the woman in the crowd, that they put their faith in Jesus. They didn't just happen to accidentally run into Jesus. They were looking for Jesus and said, we know by faith that He can help us. And the same thing is true for us today. That if we put our faith in Jesus, we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that He is there. We know that He can handle anything that goes on in our lives. No matter what it is, that He is there for us. Now, as we think about this story today, I hope that you remember that our faith in Jesus is important. That what we learned from Jairus and this woman is that it's important for us to place our faith in Jesus above everything else. And I hope that this week in Jumpstart Worship, you can take that away and begin to live that out in your life this week. Now, I want to do the last thing for our service today is I want us to take a moment and worship together again through song. So go ahead and stand back up, and I'm not going to ask you to sit back down, or I'm not going to ask you to test your chair out or anything like that. We're going to stand together and we're going to sing as we close out Jumpstart today.
When my greatest fears are